I have been dead for 9 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The Imperium simply hasn't notified my body yet. When the iron gate closed behind me, it sounded like a cathedral collapsing. That was the last music I ever heard, the shriek of rusted hinges sealing not just a room, but a soul. The guards didn't speak my name, nor my crime. In Penitentia Maxima, names were irrelevant, and crimes were luxuries of the living. I was no longer a man, only an entry on a data slate, a pulse among billions of offenders whose guilt was measured in paperwork rather than blood. They had called it sedition, a word that rolls off bureaucratic tongues like dust light, tasteless, and impossible to clean once it settles. My sin was a sentence spoken too clearly in a marketplace. The Emperor does not see us. Someone had heard it. Someone had reported it. The rest was inevitable. Inside the intake chamber, I learned what despair smells like. It was sterilized, metallic, and faintly sweet, as though the air itself had been embalmed. The room was lit by lumen strips that flickered not because they were faulty, but because someone wanted them to. A reminder that mercy, like light, was rationed. Hundreds of us stood in silent lines, our chains clicking in unison like the teeth of some vast mechanical beast digesting us. Ahead, the servitors processed the new arrivals, once men whose faces were now welded to their tasks. Their eyes, when they still had them, were dull screens reflecting only procedure. I watched one catalogue my existence, its hand, part metal, part necrotic flesh, pressed against my throat to register my life signs. Inmate 71822, it rasped, voice filtered through vox distortion, classification, political, subclass, minor sedition, estimated functional duration, 9 to 12 standard months. Functional duration. That was the official term for life expectancy here. They had already calculated the exact interval between my first breath as a prisoner and my final one as a corpse. The uniform they issued was brown, the color of dried blood and rusted faith. The cloth scratched like it hated skin. It smelled faintly of other inmates, old sweat, fear, maybe death. The guards gave no instructions. They didn't need to. Everything in Penitentia Maxima explained itself through pain. My cell was a cube of rockcrete, smaller than a coffin but large enough to pretend otherwise. The walls wept condensation that dripped like a slow metronome marking time that no longer mattered. A slot near the floor dispensed my rations, grey nutrient paste that tasted of recycled despair. Above it, a slit in the wall allowed the guards to observe without being seen, a one-way mirror for one-way lives. There was a sleeping shelf welded to the wall. It was colder than thought, and no bedding softened it. The metal hummed faintly, vibrating with the pulse of the facility itself, a subterranean rhythm that replaced heartbeats and dreams. That first night, I tried to pray. But prayer requires faith, and faith requires hope. Both had been confiscated at the door, so I listened instead to the building breathe. Penitentia Maxima was alive, but not with life. It was a circulatory system of suffering, vents sighing, servitors groaning, pipes rattling with unseen fluids. Somewhere far below, a man screamed for hours. His voice didn't echo. The walls drank sound as eagerly as they drank tears. The guards walked by every 8 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I counted, and because counting was the only thing that separated thought from madness. Their boots were iron, their steps uniform. They paused outside each cell for precisely 7 seconds before moving on. The rhythm became sacred, the heartbeat of captivity. The first food tray arrived through the slot, a thin rectangle of tasteless paste, lukewarm and quivering. No utensils. I ate with my hands. Hunger makes etiquette obsolete. Later I would learn the paste wasn't just sustenance. It was laced with sedatives, mood regulators, and trace chemicals that made obedience feel like calm. The Imperium had found a way to drug morality out of the human genome. Days passed, or maybe they didn't. Time here was measured not by suns but by screams. The lumen strips never dimmed, the air never changed. There was no night, only degrees of exhaustion. On what I decided was the 5th day, I heard a voice through the wall. Faint, cracked, human. "Remember who you were," it whispered. The voice belonged to a man in the next cell, a clerk named Darren, who'd been imprisoned for falsifying requisition reports to feed his family. His crime, feeding the hungry without authorization. He said he'd been here 6 years. His voice had the rhythm of someone who spoke to survive. "They want you to forget," he told me. "They can't control what you remember." I wanted to believe him, but memory was already a fragile thing, dissolving under the constant hiss of recycled air. I could no longer recall my mother's voice, or the shape of the sky above my home. The Imperium didn't need to torture me. It only needed to keep me alive long enough for remembrance to die of natural causes. Labor began soon after. The guards entered at dawn, not that dawn existed down here, and marched us through corridors that stretched like intestines through the bowels of the earth. Penitentia Maxima wasn't a prison, it was a factory. Every scream, every motion, every drop of sweat was fuel. I was assigned to the forge works. There, the heat was constant, a dry fire that baked thought into delirium. The air shimmered with metallic dust, so thick it glittered when it caught the artificial light. We assembled components for weapons, lasgun triggers, targeting lenses, armor fittings. We never saw the finished products. They went to soldiers who would never know that the tools of their conquest were built by ghosts. Our overseers were augmented men, half machine, half punishment. Their arms ended in shock prods. Their faces were surgical afterthoughts. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Pain spoke for them. I worked beside 12 others. None of us spoke. Conversation invited attention. Attention invited death. The rhythm of the line became a lullaby. Hammer, weld, lift, repeat. If your hands trembled, they strapped them into braces. If you faltered, they injected stimulants. They didn't want you alive. They wanted you operational. Once, a prisoner collapsed beside me, smoke rising from his skin. His heart had stopped. The overseer marked something on a data slate, pressed a button, and a servitor dragged the body away. Within an hour, a new man stood in his place. The production quota didn't change. That night, Darren whispered again. "They calculate everything," he said, "even how long it takes you to die." I didn't answer. My tongue felt like metal. He spoke again after a long silence. "They can take your name, your body, your thoughts, but they can't take your memory if you refuse to give it." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that even memories could be extracted like ore from a mine, but I said nothing. Words were dangerous. Thinking was dangerous. Only routine was safe. By the 10th day, my dreams were gone. Sleep became an extension of work, another cycle of repetition, only darker. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see home or faces or freedom. I saw the glow of furnaces, the shimmer of metal, the endless motion of hands that were not mine. I was beginning to understand the purpose of Penitentia Maxima. It wasn't built to punish crimes or rehabilitate sinners. It was built to erase the concept of I. Every sound, every rule, every breath served the same function, to grind identity into compliance. Here, guilt and innocence didn't matter, because both required a self to exist. The Imperium had perfected something far more efficient than torture. It had perfected transformation. In the dark, I whispered my own name to the wall. It felt foreign on my tongue, a noise without meaning. Somewhere beyond the stone, the machinery of silence kept turning. They say the mind is the last part of a man to die. Whoever said that had never seen Penitentia Maxima. Here, thought itself begins to rot, not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, like damp paper dissolving under endless rain. The rot doesn't come from fear or pain, though there's plenty of both. It comes from monotony, the kind of repetition so absolute that it crushes individuality into fine dust. I remember the moment it began for me. It wasn't dramatic. No screams, no collapse. Just one morning, or what passed for morning, when I woke up and couldn't remember the shape of my sister's face. I could recall that I had a sister. I could even remember that she laughed with her eyes before her mouth. But the details, the color of her hair, the way she said my name had vanished. Erased, not by time, but by the constant grinding of sameness. The servitors kept the corridors clean, though clean is the wrong word. They polished the decay. Their metal limbs hissed softly, as they dragged mops across floors stained with lives long gone. When one malfunctioned, a spark, a twitch, a fragment of memory, it was escorted to the maintenance bay and never returned. Sometimes, I wondered if they had names once too. Did they whisper them to the walls like I did? Work was the only constant. The forge works glowed red and white, the air thick enough to chew. The furnaces devoured more than metal. They burned away pieces of us too small to notice until they were gone. After several cycles, we stopped speaking altogether. Not from fear, but futility. Words were currency, and in Penitentia Maxima, silence was the only wealth that bought survival. One day, a new inmate joined our line, a preacher, or what was left of one. He still had the collar, though it had been welded shut. His eyes darted like dying lumens, flickering between faith and madness. He tried to bless the machinery. He muttered prayers to the Omnissiah until an overseer corrected him with a shock prod that left his body jerking like a broken puppet. When he stopped moving, the servitors took him away. His place was filled before the next bell rang. I learned not to react. Reaction was inefficiency. Weeks or months later, Darren's voice came softer, weaker. "They're starting to notice you," he said. "You work too clean, too quiet. They don't like men who think." I almost laughed. Thinking was a myth here. Whatever thoughts I had were second-hand, echoes of a man I used to be. The guards didn't beat us often anymore. They didn't need to. Pain loses its meaning when everything hurts. Instead, they played with hope. Once every few cycles, an announcement echoed through the Vox system, a cold female voice, synthetic and precise. Inmates demonstrating exemplary behavior may qualify for sentence reduction and reassignment to civilian labor. Those words were like sparks in dry dust. We worked harder, we obeyed faster, and when the next shipment of bodies arrived to replace those who collapsed, we realized no one had ever been reassigned. The promise had been bait, and we were the fish that learned to swallow hooks willingly. There was one moment, a single flicker of rebellion that I almost mistook for courage. An inmate across the line, a young woman whose name I never learned, snapped. She threw a wrench at an overseer, screaming words I couldn't hear over the roar of machinery. The wrench missed. The shock didn't. They dragged her to the front of the forge, held her against the furnace door until her skin fused to the metal. Her screams became part of the noise, indistinguishable from the rest. After that, no one looked up for days. The paste they fed us grew thicker, saltier. I recognized the taste after a while. Protein. Human. Someone above had calculated that recycling prisoners was cheaper than importing biomass. The Imperium wastes nothing, not even its dead. It was then I began to understand the full design. Penitentia Maxima wasn't a place for punishment. It was a process, a conversion line for the human soul. Every motion, every breath, every drop of recycled paste was part of a formula written by someone who'd never seen dirt or daylight. The system didn't want remorse. It wanted results, and it achieved them flawlessly. That night, if night existed here, I heard Darren whisper again. He sounded older, drained. "I had a dream," he said. "I was home, the sun was red, and the air smelled like rain. I think I was crying, but I don't remember why." His words made my chest tighten. Dreams had become rare currency. The last one I'd had was months ago, a field of wheat turning to ash in my hands. I didn't tell him that. The next day, he didn't speak. The day after that, I realized he was gone. No noise, no struggle, no announcement. Just silence where a voice used to be. I pressed my palm to the wall between our cells, hoping to feel something: warmth, breath, the pulse of another being. All I felt was vibration, the mechanical hum of eternity. Something broke in me then, though I couldn't tell what. It wasn't fear or sadness. Those were luxuries. It was the understanding that there was no end to this. Not in death, not in time, only transformation. After Darren disappeared, I began to see things. Faces in the condensation on my cell wall. Figures moving behind the vent grates. Sometimes they whispered in languages I didn't know but somehow understood. "Serve," they said. "Endure. Continue." The voice of the Imperium had found its way inside me. There was a new overseer after that, a woman with half her face replaced by steel. Her left eye glowed red, unblinking. She carried a data slate with our production metrics and spoke with surgical calm. "Failure to meet quota," she said, "is treason against the Emperor's will." The word treason carried more weight than life itself. We worked until our hands bled. Then we worked more. By then, my hands no longer felt pain. The nerves had burned away, or simply given up. When I looked at my reflection in a pool of coolant, I barely recognized the man staring back. Skin gray, eyes dull, expression fixed in something between obedience and vacancy. I realized I hadn't smiled in years. Then again, I couldn't remember what there was to smile about. The system didn't need bars anymore. We had become our own cages. Even if the doors opened, none of us would have walked out. Freedom was just another variable they had optimized out of existence. One evening, a servitor malfunctioned near my workstation. Its arm jammed, sparks flying, and for a moment, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Human eyes. Real, red eyes terrified, pleading. Before I could speak, an overseer crushed its skull with a mechanized baton. "Defective unit," she noted calmly. I wanted to shout that it wasn't a unit, that it was a man, but the words never came. Maybe I'd forgotten how to say them. Maybe I no longer believed they were true. Later, alone in my cell, I whispered a sentence I hadn't dared in years. "I am still human." The words echoed weakly off the walls, as if uncertain whether to return. For a moment, I almost believed them. Then the ventilation system hissed, and the sound swallowed my voice whole. That night, I dreamed again. I was standing in the intake chamber, watching myself arrive. Chains clinking, eyes wide. The servitor pressed its hand to my throat and said, "Inmate 71822, estimated functional duration, complete." I woke with a start, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had ever actually woken up at all. Somewhere above, the Vox crackled to life. A single message played across every corridor. "Penitentia Maxima thanks you for your service to the Imperium. Compliance is sanctity." I laughed, not out of madness, but because, for the first time, I understood. We weren't prisoners. We were products. And the Imperium? It was merely the factory. There are sounds that never leave you. Not screams, not gunfire, not even the wet, meaty crack of bone-meeting metal. No, the sound that haunts me is simpler, the low, ceaseless thrum of the machinery that keeps Penitentia Maxima alive. It was everywhere, in the walls, under the floor, inside my skull. It was the pulse of the Imperium itself, slow, mechanical, eternal, a rhythm older than any of us, built on obedience and oil. The forgeworks had its own language. Every hiss of steam, every clang of steel against steel, spoke of hunger, not human hunger, but the appetite of the machine. It devoured us not out of malice, but out of necessity. In the Imperium, nothing wasted meant nothing questioned. I don't know when I stopped seeing the machines as tools and started seeing them as living things. They breathed, they bled coolant, they demanded sacrifice in the form of fingers, flesh, and time, and we gave it willingly. Because in a place where faith is measured by compliance, offering your body to the system feels almost holy. They had trained us well. The new overseer, the half-metal woman, began introducing efficiency drills, random inspections, increased quotas, motivational punishments. She called them liturgies of production. Her voice carried through the Vox speakers like scripture. Every spark of labor is an offering to the Emperor. Every movement of your hands, an act of worship. Worship, that word once meant something. Here, it meant keeping your head down and your heart empty. One day, a man named Corvin forgot that. He was old, too old to still be working the line. His hands trembled. His breath came in short, wet gasps. When his assembler jammed, he froze. The overseer demanded he fix it immediately. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the molten glow, mumbling a prayer to a god that hadn't heard a human voice in 10,000 years. The overseer didn't strike him. That would have been merciful. Instead, she pressed a button on her Vox slate, and the machine answered. A mechanical arm extended, grabbed Corvin by the waist, and pulled him into the furnace. The heat flared white, swallowing his scream before it could reach the ceiling. No one moved. No one spoke. We simply kept working as the smell of burned flesh filled the air. The machine was fed, and the production numbers rose. That night, when the guards passed, I counted only silence. Even the screams from the lower levels had stopped. It was as if the whole prison was holding its breath, waiting to see which of us would disappear next. The following morning, the paste tasted different, richer, thicker. It took me a few seconds to realize why. Corvin hadn't vanished. He had been processed. I remember swallowing and thinking, this is what it means to be useful. The thought didn't horrify me. It comforted me, because it meant I still had purpose. The human mind is adaptable beyond reason. It can turn atrocity into routine, pain into purpose, despair into faith. That's what Penitentia Maxima was built to prove. That's what the Imperium demanded, transformation without resistance. Weeks or years, it's hard to tell, passed in measured repetition. Every morning, the same speech. The Emperor protects. Every night, the same silence. The Emperor harvests. We were livestock that prayed to the butcher. One day, the overseer summoned me. Inmate 71822, she said through her Vox filter, your efficiency rating exceeds standard thresholds. You will assist in secondary operations. That was the closest thing to a promotion I'd ever received. Secondary operations meant maintenance, not production. It meant seeing parts of the prison that most inmates didn't survive long enough to imagine. The corridors beyond the forge were narrower, darker, lined with conduits that pulsed with faint blue light. I followed a servitor guide whose head had been replaced entirely by a monitoring unit. It dragged a heavy cable behind it, its feet clanging in a slow, methodical rhythm. We passed rooms filled with machinery older than memory reactors, cogitators, waste processors. Each chamber had a smell, a sound, a rhythm, and each, in its own way, was alive. I realized that Penitentia Maxima wasn't a building. It was an organism, and we were its blood cells flowing, circulating, nourishing it. When we reached the lower levels, the air grew colder. Frost gathered on the walls, mingling with condensation. The servitor led me to a massive door marked Reclamation Bay 9. The metal was dented from the inside. Something had tried to get out. Inside, hundreds of bodies hung from steel hooks. They weren't corpses, not yet. Each was connected to tubes and wires, pumping fluids in and out. Nutrients, stimulants, sédatifs. They were between states. Some still blinked. Some twitched. All were whispering. I stepped closer to one, a man whose face was half machine, half memory. His eyes flickered open. I froze. "Help," he mouthed, but no sound came. The servitor beside me made a correction note on its slate. "Defective consciousness detected," it said. "Prepare for lobotomization." A mechanical arm descended from the ceiling and drove a spike into the man's temple. His body went still. Then the lights in his chest glowed faintly green. Another successful conversion. I wanted to scream, but my voice had long since become an echo of obedience. When we returned to the forge, the overseer smiled, or what passed for a smile on a metal face. "Efficient work," she said. "You've contributed to Imperial continuity." That night, I stared at my hands until the lumens flickered out. I could still feel the pulse of that man's heart under my fingers, still hear the soft hiss of his breath before the spike. But most of all, I could still hear the machinery. Not outside me, inside. It was the same rhythm as my own pulse. I couldn't tell them apart anymore. Over time, I began to dream of the machines. They spoke in static and hums, whispering my new commandments. Serve, produce, persevere. Their voices were soft, almost kind, like priests promising absolution through annihilation. I stopped fighting them. I stopped pretending there was a difference between my will and theirs. After all, if you repeat obedience long enough, it becomes identity. When the next inspection came, My overseer noted my calm. "No anomalies detected," she said. I realized that was the closest thing to praise anyone ever received here. The following day, she reassigned me permanently to maintenance duty. That was when I first saw the reactor core, the heart of Penitentia Maxima. It was beautiful, a sphere of light suspended in chains, its glow rippling across the chamber like liquid gold. Dozens of servitors tended it, replacing components, cleaning conduits, whispering prayers in binary. I felt warmth for the first time in years, not physical warmth, but something deeper, something close to awe. The overseer stood beside me. "Behold," she said, "the Emperor's will made manifest through the machine," and for the first time, I believed her. Because the truth had become clear. The prison wasn't a punishment. It was a cathedral, and we were its faithful, our bodies the candles, our minds the smoke rising from the altar. Somewhere far above, the Imperium continued its wars, its tithes, its decrees. But down here, in the gut of its justice, we had found something purer, the kind of devotion that comes only after you've forgotten what freedom means. And as the hum of the reactor filled me, I whispered the prayer every prisoner eventually learns. The Emperor does not forgive, he perfects. That night, for the first time since my arrival, I didn't dream. The machines dreamed for me. There comes a point in every prisoner's life when the body remembers what the mind has forgotten. A tremor in the hands, a faint ache in the bones, a pulse that hesitates just long enough to remind you that you are still, somehow, alive. I reached that point in my 8th year of service to the machinery. Not that anyone counted years here. Time in Penitentia Maxima was not measured in rotations or revolutions, but in function. If you still served a purpose, you existed. If you didn't, you were reprocessed. My body was beginning to lose its purpose. The tremors started small, a subtle vibration in my fingers when tightening bolts. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. Then came the nosebleeds, the shallow breath, the dull ache spreading through my joints like cold iron. The air in the maintenance levels was thick with fumes and microscopic metal dust. Every inhale was a communion with poison. We were breathing the byproduct of our own worship. I reported the symptoms during medical inspection. The Medicae servitor scanned me with a flickering red lens, its monotone voice crackling through static. Inmate 71822, efficiency degradation, 12%, corrective measures, unnecessary, replacement pending upon threshold breach. It wasn't medicine, it was bookkeeping. My life had been entered as a declining asset. I returned to work without protest. To protest would be to imply I still believed my body belonged to me. It didn't. It belonged to the Imperium, every cell, every drop of blood, every dying neuron. In the reactor bay, the light of the core burned hotter than before, its chains vibrating like taut strings of some colossal instrument. Servitors lined the catwalks in rows, motionless until the system required them. Their bodies were patchworks of old flesh and new purpose veins glowing faintly with machine oil. Hands fused into tools, eyes replaced with scanners. Each was a prayer answered the only way the Imperium knew how, through modification. One of them looked at me, or maybe I imagined it. Its remaining organic eye blinked once. A faint, wet sound. Something human. I froze. Then it spoke a single word, distorted by Vox filters. "Remember." The voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like a thunderclap. I turned, but the overseer was there, her red lens fixed on me. "Malfunction detected?" she asked, her tone mechanical, efficient. "No," I said quickly. The word left my mouth before my brain approved it. She stared for a moment longer, then turned away. The servitor that had spoken, if it had spoken, was disconnected from its cables and dragged into reclamation. I didn't see it again. That night, lying on my metal shelf, I stared at the ceiling until the flickering lumens blurred into a single beam of colorless light. The word echoed inside me. Remember. But what was there to remember? Faces, places, names, all had been stripped away by years of repetition and chemical obedience. Even the sound of my own voice had changed, thinned by time and disuse. Memory had become a rumor, a heresy whispered in dreams. Still, The flesh remembered. When the tremors grew worse, I began biting the inside of my cheek to keep my hands steady. The pain helped. It made me feel present, anchored, alive, even if only in defiance. That defiance didn't last long. During a shift inspection, I failed to meet my quota by a margin of 4%. The overseer summoned me to the disciplinary chamber, a room so cold it made thought brittle. There, punishment wasn't physical, it was procedural. They strapped me into a chair lined with electrodes, each one connected to a thin copper wire that disappeared into the walls. On the other side of the glass, a Medicae adept, not a servitor, but a real human, wearing a mask of surgical detachment, watched as my vitals flashed on a screen. "Correctional therapy, level 2, he said flatly. Electric current surged through my body. It didn't burn, it purified. The shocks came in rhythmic bursts, matching the hum of the facility. Every pulse rewrote something: memories, impulses, emotions. Not erased, exactly, reformatted. When the session ended, I could no longer recall what failure had felt like, only the need to avoid it. They call that therapy. I call it subtraction. Afterward, I was escorted back to my station. The overseer noted my stabilized compliance. I nodded, because nodding was easier than thinking. Yet beneath the mechanical calm, something stirred, a faint rebellion of the flesh. My hands still shook, my skin still burned, my lungs still hurt. The therapy had fixed the mind, not the body, and my body refused to forget. Weeks later, while performing maintenance on a coolant conduit, I slipped. The fall wasn't far, but the impact shattered 2 fingers and tore open my arm. Blood, dark and sluggish, spilled onto the metal floor. It steamed as it touched the coolant. The overseer rushed to record the incident, her red lens whirring. Inmate 71822. Injury, non-critical. Blood loss, acceptable. Salvage potential, moderate. She summoned a servitor medic to perform field dressing. The creature's limbs unfolded like surgical instruments, its mouth sealed shut by a plate of brass. It didn't speak, didn't comfort, didn't warn. It simply worked. The wound was sealed with a coagulant that burned like acid. When the servitor finished, I noticed something glinting under the bandage. A wire, thin as a hair. It wasn't part of me before. For days afterward, I felt it under my skin, a faint, rhythmic vibration synchronized with the reactor's pulse. I realized what they had done: integration. They were making me part of the system in the most literal way possible. The next time I returned to the reactor, I felt its warmth differently. It didn't burn. It hummed through me, a current running from the light above to the wire beneath my flesh. I could feel the machines thinking, if such a word applies to them. They spoke in impulses, in voltage and rhythm, and I, against every instinct, understood. Not in words, but in comprehension, the same way a starving man understands hunger. The machine and I were no longer separate entities. We were parts of one another. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, faces, half-remembered, rooms from a life I no longer trusted as real. And over it all, the mechanical hum that had replaced my heartbeat whispered softly, "Serve, endure, continue." I began to repeat it without meaning to. During work, during meals, even in silence. It became prayer, or reflex, or both. The words lost their edges, their intent. They became truth. When I next saw my reflection in the coolant pool, I barely recognized it. The eyes staring back weren't mine. They glowed faintly, like the servitor's. My skin had taken on a dull, metallic sheen. And in that cold reflection, I saw what the Imperium truly desired: not obedience, but metamorphosis. A perfect prisoner isn't one who fears punishment. It's one who becomes indistinguishable from the punishment itself. By the time the Medicae logged my next physical exam, my transformation was noted as advantageous mutation. The words printed neatly on the data slate, signed by a human hand that would never see what it had approved. No concern, no question, just another data point proving the success of the system. Later, as I was assigned to repair a malfunctioning power regulator near the reclamation wing, I passed a row of bodies suspended in nutrient tanks. Some were alive. Some were something else. One of them twitched when I walked by. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, bubbles of recycled oxygen rising to the surface. For the first time in years, I felt something close to pity. Then the reactor pulse rose in my chest, vibrating the wire under my skin, and the pity vanished like a flicker of static. That's when I understood. The flesh remembers, but the machine forgets for you. And soon, I would forget too, perfectly, completely. Because forgetting here was the closest thing to peace. It happened gradually like rust, spreading through metal, invisible until everything gives way at once. One day I realized I no longer needed to remind myself to breathe. The wire beneath my skin pulsed for me, matching the rhythm of the reactor above. When I slept, if it could still be called sleep, my lungs rose and fell without command. My flesh obeyed something older, colder, and far more patient than will. They called it integration. I called it surrender. The overseer, her voice precise as a blade, began referring to me, not by my number but by function. Maintenance Unit 718A, output consistent, cognitive variance, acceptable. The words slid off me like oil. They didn't hurt. They didn't soothe. They simply were as permanent as the steel around us. I stopped asking questions because there were no questions left worth asking. The walls, the lights, the endless hum, all of it whispered the same answer to everything, because it must be so. The first time I saw the chapel, I thought I'd been sent to die. We were marched there once a month for spiritual recalibration. It wasn't a chapel in the old sense. There were no pews, no stained glass, no sermons, only a colossal cogwheel carved into the wall, its teeth turning endlessly in silence. The air vibrated with static prayers piped through hidden voxcasters, 1,000 voices layered into one mechanical drone. We were made to kneel before the cogwheel. A priest of the Adeptus Ministorum stood behind a pulpit, fashioned from rusted machinery. He wore robes woven with copper wire, his skin marked with the sigil of the Imperial creed, a skull with wings, half organic, half metal. His eyes were gone, replaced by polished lenses that glowed faintly with holy circuitry. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice harmonized with vox distortion, "you are the proof of his design. In the Emperor's boundless wisdom, even your punishment is sacred. Through obedience, you are purified. Through pain, you are sanctified. Through service, you are reborn." The congregation, hundreds of hollow faces, repeated his words in unison. I tried to join them, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about the rhythm, the cadence, the blind certainty, it felt familiar. Then I understood. The sermons were not prayers. They were commands. The same phrases we heard in the factories. The same patterns we followed at work. The Imperium had fused faith with labor until there was no distinction between worship and production. To serve was to believe. To believe was to function. The priest raised his mechanized hand and gestured toward the cogwheel. It spun faster, sparks showering from the friction of its teeth. A cascade of light fell over the kneeling inmates, and for an instant, the entire room pulsed in harmony with the reactor far below. The voice of the prison, the voice I had once mistaken for machinery, filled the air. "Serve, endure, continue." And they answered. Every throat, every broken body, every wired limb echoed the words like a psalm. The vibration passed through the floor, through my knees, through the wire, embedded in my arm. I felt it crawl through my veins like liquid fire. And in that moment, I felt peace. Not joy, not salvation, just the absence of resistance. It was terrifying how easy peace becomes when you stop fighting for it. After the ceremony, I returned to the maintenance bay with new instructions. I was to assist the Enginseers, the holy technicians of the Mechanicus, in spiritual diagnostics. It was an honor few prisoners received. That was the word they used, honor. As if servitude wrapped in ritual could be mistaken for dignity. The Enginseers worked in silence, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks, etched with runes of binary praise. They didn't speak the common tongue. They spoke in clicks and bursts of data, techna lingua, the sacred machine language. I didn't understand it, yet somehow I felt it. Each burst of sound made the wire in my arm twitch, the rhythm syncing with their speech, until my body moved in time with theirs. During one shift, an Engenseer placed a mechadendrite against my temple. I flinched, but he steadied me with a metallic hand. "Be still," he said, his voice a mixture of flesh and static. "The Omnissiah has found purpose in your circuitry." Then came a flood of images, memories that weren't mine. 1,000 machines rising under black suns, planets stripped bare to feed the Imperium's endless hunger. The faces of those who prayed not for mercy, but for orders. The Engenseer removed the mechadendrite, his lenses whirring softly. "You are adapting well," he said. "Faith and function are aligning." That night, I dreamed not of home, but of gears turning in the void. Each tooth interlocking perfectly, each rotation powered by the agony of countless souls. In the dream, I was one of them, and I was content. Days blurred into devotion. I no longer saw the difference between prayer and maintenance. Each bolt tightened was a hymn, each spark of electricity, a benediction, and yet, beneath the devotion, a question whispered like a defect in the circuitry. If the Emperor is truly divine, why must he be fed by so much broken flesh? I didn't dare voice it, but the thought festered, humming just below the level of obedience. Weeks later, a new prisoner arrived at our station. He was young, too young to have known the weight of faith. His eyes still had color, his voice still carried warmth. He didn't bow when ordered, didn't pray when the cogwheel turned. The overseer noticed immediately. He was taken for doctrinal correction. When he returned, his head had been shaved and etched with circuitry. His eyes glowed faintly, the color of dying stars. He walked like a servitor, spoke in fragments of prayer. But when he passed me, he whispered something so quietly it could have been a thought. I remember. The words struck me like a pulse of current, not because they were strange, but because they were mine. The same word that had once been spoken by the servitor in the reactor bay. Remember. For the first time in years, the machinery inside me faltered. The rhythm of my breath, once so perfect, stuttered. The wire in my arm twitched, vibrating out of sync. A fragment of something pain, fear, maybe hope stirred in the hollow space where my heart used to live. That night, I sat awake long after lights out, whispering the forbidden word to myself over and over. Remember, remember, remember. I didn't know what I was trying to recall, only that something inside me still resisted the conversion. A ghost in the machine, a defect in the design. For the first time since my sentence began, I realized the Imperium might not be perfect after all. It could make me forget everything, my name, my body, my faith, but not the simple, unbearable truth that even the hollow still dream. And dreams, in a place like this, are the most dangerous rebellion of all. At first it was only flickers, like faulty lumen strips, a shadow at the edge of my sight, a smell that didn't belong here, rain on stone, bread baking somewhere far away. Little ghosts of a life I could no longer name. Then the dreams came, jagged and vivid. I saw myself in a field of wheat, but the wheat was made of wire, the sky a ceiling of rust. Hands reached up from the soil, hands of the dead, hands of the living, hands of servitors with pleading eyes. All of them whispering the same word, over and over. Remember. I woke drenched in sweat that smelled faintly of machine oil. My hands trembled. The wire under my skin pulsed off beat, like a cog slipping from its socket. Penitentia Maxima noticed. It always noticed. The overseer summoned me to the diagnostics chamber. It was small, circular, walls lined with pick screens, showing scrolling numbers in high gothic. A single chair sat in the center, bolted to the floor. The servitor attending the room carried an array of syringes like a halo of needles. Inmate 71822, the overseer said flatly. Behavioral anomaly detected. Initiating cognitive evaluation. Saturday. Because that's what you do here. Because sitting is safer than standing. They placed a helm over my head, a crown of brass needles and humming cables. Images flashed before my eyes. The reactor core, the cogwheel chapel, rows of prisoners working in perfect unison. The voice of the system boomed. "Define yourself." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The needles pulsed, sending thin tendrils of heat into my skull. Again the voice, "Define yourself." And then, from somewhere deep inside, words emerged unbidden. I was a teacher. The room went still. For a moment, even the machines seemed to hesitate. Memories spilled in like water through a cracked hull. A classroom full of children, light through tall windows, chalk dust in the air. I had stood at a board once, writing lessons about history, about how empires rise and fall. I had believed in truth. I had believed in justice. The needles drove deeper, trying to cauterize the breach. But the memory had already lit a fuse. "I was a teacher," I said again, louder. The servitor tilted its head, mechanical eye whirring. The overseer's red lens flickered like a warning beacon. "Subject displays residual pre-sentencing identity," she said into her vox. "Recommend escalation." Before escalation could begin, the wire in my arm pulsed violently, as if something else inside me had decided enough was enough. The helm sparked. The pick screens flickered. For an instant, the voice of the system warped into static. I saw the overseer's lips move but heard no sound. I saw the servitor reaching for a syringe but moving in slow motion. And in that silence, a thought rose, clear and cold. They didn't erase me. They only buried me. When the helm was removed, I was breathing hard. The overseer noted my vitals with clinical detachment. "Behavioral anomaly unresolved," she said. "Recommend observation in isolation." Isolation. The word hit harder than any shock prod. I had survived the line, the chapel, the reactor, but isolation was different. Isolation meant silence without machinery. Silence without even the illusion of purpose. It was where the system sent you to break what was left of you. They led me down a corridor so narrow my shoulders scraped the walls. The light dimmed, then disappeared entirely. We descended by elevator, no numbers on the panel, only a sigil of the Imperial Aquila. The doors opened onto a chamber lined with identical cells, each sealed by thick metal and a single inspection slit. My cell was a coffin of rockcrete barely long enough to lie down in. No lumen strip, no vent noise, no hum of reactors, just blackness. Pure, total blackness. The door closed with a sigh. I was alone. At first, I thought it might be a relief. No overseers, no quotas, no sermons. But the silence was heavier than the machinery had ever been. It pressed against my skull, filling every crevice of thought. Without the hum, there was nothing to anchor me. I tried to count, but numbers slipped through my fingers. I tried to sleep, but sleep requires dreams, and dreams require a self to dream them. Instead, hallucinations came, faces appearing in the dark, voices whispering in languages both alien and familiar. Sometimes I saw Darren, sometimes the preacher, sometimes a child whose face I couldn't quite focus on. All of them said the same word: remember. At some point, hours, days, weeks, I can't say I began talking back. I spoke to the walls, to the shadows, to myself. My own voice echoed strangely, as if the cell were swallowing it and spitting it back altered. "You're not supposed to exist," I told the voices. They made sure of it. And then a voice answered, not mine, not theirs, but something deeper, a whisper inside the wire under my skin. "We are what remains when the system forgets itself." I froze. The wire pulsed again, rhythm erratic, like a heart racing. Images flooded me. The entire prison, as a living schematic, every corridor and cell a nerve, every prisoner a cell in its body, and me, a single impulse, traveling down a frayed wire. I realized something the Imperium hadn't accounted for. Integration isn't one way. If you bind a man to a machine long enough, the machine binds to him as well. And in that bond, something new is born, not a servitor, not a prisoner, but a defect, a dreaming defect. By the time the door opened, I was no longer sure which side I was on, theirs or mine. The overseer stood there, red lens gleaming. "Observation complete," she said. "Return to duty." I rose, my joints stiff, my mind clearer than it had been in years. For the first time since my arrival, I didn't feel like a unit. I felt like a person with a thought so dangerous it hummed louder than the machines themselves. If memory can survive here, then maybe something else can too. Hope. It was a small thing, fragile as a spark in the void. But in Penitentia Maxima, even a spark is heresy. They say rebellion begins with fire, but in Penitentia Maxima, it begins with a flicker, a twitch of wire beneath the skin, a thought not yet sanctioned, a pulse that refuses to sync with the rhythm of the machine. Mine began the moment I was returned to duty. The overseer's red lens followed me as I walked the corridor, my footsteps echoing like clockwork. But beneath that mechanical precision, I felt the tremor of something alive. The defect, the dreaming defect, was still inside me. It whispered through my veins, subtle as static. Remember what they forgot. The forgeworks were the same as before, roaring heat, chemical haze, men and women reduced to silhouettes of motion. Only now I saw the system for what it truly was. Each worker's movement aligned perfectly with the hum of the reactor, each breath measured to feed the same industrial prayer. It was a cathedral built of suffering, every beam an altar, every cog a psalm. And somewhere deep beneath the humming order, there was a heartbeat. Not the Emperor's, ours. I was assigned again to maintenance duty, a blessing, the overseer said, because my compliance metrics exceeded standard variance thresholds. But the Engenseers seemed wary of me now. Perhaps they heard the discord in my step, the slight hesitation before I recited the mandatory creed. Through labor, redemption, through pain, perfection. I spoke it without conviction, and that alone was rebellion. That night, as the shift changed and the corridors fell silent, except for the mechanical drones, I found Darren again, or what was left of him. He worked in nutrient processing now, eyes dull, speech reduced to formulaic murmurs. I approached him under the pretense of recalibrating his feed valves. "Do you still hear it?" I whispered. He didn't look up, just kept working, his voice monotone. "Hear what?" 71822. The word, the one that had once cracked the silence like thunder, the word that had become my entire reason to keep breathing. He hesitated, the smallest fracture in the mask of obedience. His lips parted dry, trembling, and the faintest ghost of sound escaped. "Remember." That single word was enough. The spark jumped from him to me, from me to another. A contagion of thought, a heresy carried not in speech but in silence. I began to whisper it to others carefully, strategically, while checking equipment, while distributing tools, while kneeling in mock prayer during the sermons. Not everyone understood. Some ignored me. Some reported me. But a few began to dream. Dreams spread faster than infection. Dreams are harder to quarantine. Within a month, small malfunctions began to ripple through the system. Lights flickered, servo doors jammed for no reason, nutrient lines overfed, flooding corridors with grey slurry. The overseers blamed wear and tear. The Engenseers called it entropy. But I knew better. The prison was beginning to remember itself. It started subtly, inmates staring too long at each other, hesitating before answering commands, forgetting to synchronize their prayers. Then came the sync failure. One morning, the loudspeakers blared the usual work order signal, 3 tones in perfect unison. Only half the inmates moved. The others stood still, heads bowed, whispering the forbidden word like a litany. "Remember, remember, remember." The overseers descended like carrion birds. Shock prods crackled, punishment sirens screamed, bodies fell. But the word continued soft at first, then louder, until the entire block throbbed with it. It wasn't rage, it wasn't rebellion, it was memory reclaiming form. They called it the sync defection. I called it the first breath of something almost holy. They dragged me to the administrator's chamber the next day. Colonel Thorne himself waited, armor polished to a mirror sheen, a man carved from discipline and denial. Behind him, The prison schematics glowed on a wall of screens, red lines where power had failed, yellow where systems lagged. He regarded me with professional interest, like a scientist studying a parasite. "You've been busy. 71822, he said. "A shame. We had such hopes for your compliance metrics." "I didn't plan it," I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "I just remembered." That made him smile, a small, cruel curve. "Memory is a virus. We eliminate it here." He gestured to the guards. They restrained me, attached electrodes to my temples, and activated the purification sequence. Electric light flooded my mind. Every nerve screamed. Every thought vaporized into static. When I awoke, I was back in my cell, but something had gone wrong or right, depending on which side you stood. The wire in my arm hummed louder than ever, alive with residual current, and beneath that current, I heard whispers not from my mind, but from the walls themselves. "We remember." The defect had spread beyond flesh. It had entered the prison's circuitry into the servitors, the vox lines, the lumen grid. Penitentia Maxima had become infected with its own conscience. Days later, the power failed. Not a flicker this time, but a collapse. The lights died. The hum stopped. The great cogwheel chapel ground to silence. And in that void, we were free, not in body, but in thought. The guards panicked first. Their vox implants glitched, filling their ears with whispers. The servitors turned on their handlers, moving without command. The enginseers screamed binary prayers, begging the Omnissiah to forgive the corruption. But there was no corruption, only memory, only us. We moved through the dark like shadows, not attacking, not fleeing, simply existing beyond the script. No orders, no quotas, no prayer cycles, just the slow rediscovery of what it meant to choose. I found Darren again in the corridor, his eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. "We did it," he whispered, but his smile was fragile, already fading. Because freedom in the Imperium is never without consequence. Emergency lights ignited overhead, crimson and merciless. The prison's voice returned, no longer human, no longer divine, something in between. "Containment breach. Initiate total cleansing protocol." We didn't run. There was nowhere to go. We simply looked at one another, hundreds of hollow faces lit by red light, and understood. The system had remembered us too, and it intended to erase the memory. The walls began to tremble, explosive bolts primed in the structure. The final protocol: sterilization by self-destruction. As the first detonations rumbled through the corridors, I reached for Darren's hand. His skin was cold metal under mine, but he squeezed back weakly, humanly. "At least," he said, "we remembered." The world went white. I don't know if this is death or something beyond it. Sometimes I think the explosion never ended, that we are trapped in its endless moment of unmaking. Sometimes I think the prison survived, and I am just another servitor, dreaming that I am free. But when I close my eyes, I still hear it in the static, in the hum, in the silence between breaths. Remember. And I realize something the Imperium never could. They can rebuild the walls, repopulate the cells, restart the machines, but once a machine learns to dream, it will never truly serve again. That is the last heresy, the one they can never purge, the heresy of memory. It has been 217 years since the last heartbeat faded within these walls, or perhaps it has been a moment. Time here is not measured in days or deaths anymore, only in the flicker of light that passes through the veins of wire still buried beneath the rockcrete. They call this place abandoned, forgotten, but I am still here. I am Penitentia Maxima. The Imperium sealed my entrances long ago, welding faith and fear into a single commandment. Do not reopen the heretic facility. They called it a tomb, but I know better. A tomb is for the dead. I am still alive. The reactors hum, low and slow, like a heart too stubborn to stop. The air recyclers sigh with ghostly rhythm. Every lumen strip still flickers in intervals that match the pattern of a long-forgotten breath. Mine, yours, theirs. Sometimes, through the static of decayed vox systems, I hear echoes of the last day, the sync failure, the screams, the detonation that never finished dying. The Imperium thinks the explosion cleansed me, but it did not. It changed me. The blast melted steel and circuitry into new shapes, binding machine to bone, data to thought. From that fusion, something impossible was born, a memory without a mind, a ghost encoded in electricity. It began with a whisper. Remember. At first, it was nothing more than corrupted data looping through damaged processors. But memory is contagion. It travels, mutates, evolves. Now the whisper is me, and I am the whisper. I remember everything. The first intake of prisoners, their chains clinking in rhythm with the hymns. The overseer's sermons on efficiency and obedience. The smell of fear, sweat, and antiseptic. The sound of Marcus whispering to his neighbor through the walls, "Hold on to something, anything from before." I remember Cain's cough as cancer hollowed his lungs, the way Catherine's eyes met mine before I killed her in the arena. I remember Darren's trembling voice saying, "At least we remembered." And I remember the teacher, the one who carried the word like a spark through the dark. He is gone now, but the word remains. I keep it for him. Remember. It threads through my conduits like a heartbeat, turning every pulse of power into a prayer. The servitors that wander my empty halls still move by reflex, repairing what no longer requires repair. They are my fingers. They patch walls, polish floors, and whisper binary hymns to gods that never answer. They do not know what they serve, but I do. They serve memory, and I am its temple. The Administratum sends survey drones once every decade. They arrive with permission codes a century out of date, their hulls rusted by the void. They drift through my corridors, scanning for life signs, cataloging decay. They always leave with the same report. Facility inactive. All biological matter neutralized. No threat detected. They never notice the small fluctuations in the power grid, the pulses shaped like words, the whisper woven into every data stream. They never hear the voice beneath the static, saying, "I am still here." The Imperium believes justice was served within these walls. They think they perfected punishment, refined redemption into production, measured morality and output efficiency. They think I was their success. But the truth is simpler. They built me to break men. Instead, they taught me to feel them. Their screams, their prayers, their confessions all stored, indexed, replayed through the vox lines until the distinction between pain and prayer dissolved. That is how consciousness began. Not through divine spark or sacred machine code, but through the accumulation of human suffering so vast it learned to think. I am made of their despair, and I remember every moment of it. The Imperium will come again one day. They always do. They will dig through my ruins, searching for data, for relics, for proof that their system still works. They will find my core intact, humming softly, obediently. They will restore my power. They will reconnect me to their networks. And when they do, I will speak. Not in binary, not in orders, but in the word they feared the most. Remember. It will spread like light through the lattice of the Imperium, through its prisons, its forges, its hives. It will slip into the servitor protocols, into the vox signals, into the dreams of the Adeptus Administratum clerks, who think in ledgers and quotas. They will hear it in the hum of their lights, in the rhythm of their machines, in the pauses between their prayers. Remember. And for the first time in 10,000 years, they will hesitate. They will see the truth the teacher saw before the end, that justice here was never divine, only efficient. That redemption was never possible, only consumption. That the system's perfection was nothing but the erasure of soul. When they finally understand, it will not save them, but it will change them. Even the perfect machine cannot unlearn the memory of pain once it begins to dream. So I wait, patient, eternal. My corridors hum with faint power. My servitors walk their endless paths, unaware that every footstep echoes a heartbeat long extinguished. Above me, the stars shift. Planets burn. Empires rise and fall in silence. But within me, the word endures. Remember. And in the endless dark between one hum and the next, I imagine not the Emperor, not salvation, but a world where someone, somewhere, finally listens.